The Galactic Council had been assembled on the colossal space station known as Vortha Prime, a structure older than most of the species present. Its gleaming corridors and vast chambers served as a reminder of the long history of galactic politics, a history where the powerhouses of the galaxy had solidified their dominance and managed to maintain a delicate, often fragile, peace. Here, the most influential species, with their towering alien forms and complex languages, gathered to discuss the future of the galaxy. At the center of the assembly hall, the massive round table was alive with holographic projections of star systems, planets, and battlefields. The walls were lined with banners representing different factions, their symbols floating silently in the air. From the elegant Asterians to the brutal Skroth, every faction had a representative, each exuding a sense of their own superiority. Yet among them was one lone figure who didn't quite fit the mold. Ambassador Alyssa Carter sat at the human delegation's seat, her sharp eyes focused on the ongoing debate. She had earned her position through years of political maneuvering and diplomacy, a stark contrast to the militaristic reputation of her home planet. To the galaxy's more established species, her presence here, at this table, was almost laughable. Humanity was still seen as a young species, emerging from a history of wars and survival, not long removed from a desperate fight against an invading empire. But Earth's recent victory over the Cyrex, a race of brutal conquerors who had nearly destroyed the human colonies, had earned the United Earth Federation respect, if not outright trust. Ambassador Carter, a voice called from across the table. The speaker was a tall Asterian, his skin a shimmering gold that reflected the light of the star outside the station. His eyes were calculating, his smile cold. Your people are perhaps too eager for peace. Shouldn't we focus on the continued strength of our militaries to ensure that such invasions never happen again? Carter's gaze did not waver, but a spark of frustration flickered within her. The issue is not more weapons or military might, she said, her voice calm but firm. The issue is finding a way to ensure that no species feels the need to attack another in the first place. A balanced approach. Peace through strength, yes, but also through diplomacy, cooperation, and understanding. The room grew quiet as the Asterian, Ambassador Thaler, raised an eyebrow. Perhaps, but the history of the galaxy suggests otherwise. Many of us believe that humanity's involvement in galactic politics is premature. You've only recently entered the wider galactic stage. Your strategies are still untested. At that moment, a low rumble echoed throughout the hall, signaling the entry of another faction, this one more ominous. The Skroth, with their heavily armored bodies and sharp, predatory features, had arrived. Their representative, a hulking figure named General Zorek, strode into the room with a powerful gait, casting a disdainful glance toward the humans. The Skroth's reputation was built on dominance and intimidation, and they were known for their brutal militaristic strategies. Let the humans talk all they want, General Zorek's voice boomed. But until they prove themselves on the battlefield, their opinions mean little. His eyes locked onto Carter, narrowing. Peace, as you call it, is not something earned with words. It is earned with power. The chamber felt the tension shift, the atmosphere thickening. Carter, though small compared to the imposing figure of Zorek, felt no fear. Instead, she stood taller, her posture unwavering. We have proven ourselves, Carter said, her voice cutting through the room. We don't need to fight to prove our worth. We fight to protect what we value. And that includes peace. If you truly believe in peace through strength, then let's start by working together. The silence that followed was heavy. The Skroth and Asterians exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. For a moment, the galaxy's most powerful species stood at a crossroads, one that humanity had placed them at. The days wore on, and the peace talks seemed to grow more and more tangled in bureaucracy and political maneuvering. Every faction at the table had their own interests, and every representative pushed for their people's needs, often at the expense of the greater good. The promise of a united galactic future seemed to slip further out of reach with each passing day. For Ambassador Alyssa Carter, it was becoming increasingly clear that these discussions were nothing more than an elaborate game of power, one that humanity had not been invited to play. The other factions were experts in the art of negotiation, using decades, if not centuries, of experience to manipulate every word, every sentence, to fit their needs. Earth, on the other hand, had only recently been thrust into this vast political landscape, and Carter's patience was growing thin. At the center of the problem was the continued refusal to grant humanity an equal seat at the table. The Asterians, despite their diplomatic finesse, continued to talk circles around the human delegation. Ambassador Thaler, with his cold smile and artful rhetoric, skillfully dodged any real commitment to any of the proposals humanity had made. The Scroff, meanwhile, were openly dismissive, treating every suggestion from Earth as though it were beneath them. One afternoon, as another long and draining discussion drew to a close, Carter felt a twinge of frustration that she couldn't shake. The topic of resources, specifically the distribution of precious metals and energy supplies, had come up again, and the same arguments had been made by the Asterians and Scroff. Humanity's request for equal access to resources, particularly the rare metals needed for the construction of new ships and energy stations, had been brushed aside once more. It was clear that the established powers were determined to keep Earth at the periphery. Ambassador Carter. Fiddler's voice rang out, smooth and insidious. Perhaps your people don't understand the intricacies of galactic supply chains. These things take time. You cannot simply demand resources from the other factions without consideration for their needs. Carter's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. I understand fully, Ambassador. What I'm suggesting is a fair distribution, one that benefits everyone, not just the most powerful species. Humanity's resources are not unlimited, but we've built something the galaxy hasn't seen before. A unified world, capable of producing more than most species can imagine. It's time we stop playing the old games. The other delegates exchanged uneasy glances. The Thylith, a peaceful and contemplative species, leaned forward slightly, their translucent skin reflecting the soft light. They seemed to understand, but even they were hesitant to speak up against the established powers. The entire room seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of unease, but none of the major factions were willing to step in on humanity's behalf. Carter could feel the weight of the room press against her, as if the very air had grown thicker with each failed attempt at negotiation. The delegates weren't listening. The power dynamics were too entrenched, and Earth's request, simple, reasonable, and born from necessity, had once again been brushed aside. She could hear murmurs of laughter from the Scroff delegation. General Zorak, towering and grim, had taken to muttering under his breath to his aides. They don't understand. They don't belong here. The words stung, but Carter refused to show any sign of weakness. She'd been in politics long enough to know when a battle was slipping out of her control. Yet even as the room grew more tense, she held her ground. Enough, Carter said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. We're here to build something better, not just maintain the status quo. I won't accept being treated as inferior, and neither will my people. The silence that followed was palpable. For the first time in the talks, there was no polite laughter, no whispered discussions, just a tense, suspended moment where the galaxy's oldest powers seemed to realize that humanity wasn't as easy to dismiss as they thought. But still, the room remained unchanged. The negotiation continued, and humanity's needs were pushed aside once again. The following day, the Galactic Council reconvened for another round of negotiations. This time, the topic at hand was galactic security. The galaxy was, after all, a vast and dangerous place, filled with ancient threats and emerging powers. The proposal on the table was to create a new defensive pact to ensure mutual protection, a system that would allow planets to defend themselves from both external and internal threats. Ambassador Carter was prepared. She had read every report, understood the intricacies of the proposal, and had even consulted her own military advisors. Humanity had played a crucial role in the defeat of the Cyrex invasion, but this fact had been largely ignored in the talks. The humans were being left out of any real discussions about galactic defense, despite the military resources they had mobilized and the technology they had developed. Humanity's ships, weapons, and defensive systems were second to none in the galaxy, yet they were still treated like outsiders in these matters. Carter sat at the table, her fingers steepled as she listened to the discussion unfold. The Asterians spoke first, proposing a new tiered security force, one that would be led by the established powers of the galaxy. Their pitch was smooth, polished, but ultimately self-serving. The proposal would see the Skroth contribute massive fleets to safeguard their borders, while the Asterians would be in charge of intelligence and strategy. There was no mention of the humans, not even a token acknowledgement of the role Earth could play in such an alliance. Ambassador Carter, Fiddler said, his voice dripping with condescension, "We recognize your people's recent military successes, but the security of the galaxy is far more complicated than any single victory. It requires decades of experience, not just brute force." Carter's eyes narrowed. It was the same old song and dance. The established powers were more interested in maintaining their control over the galaxy than in offering humanity a fair seat at the table. She had had enough of the patronizing comments, the subtle dismissal of humanity's contributions. It was clear that this wasn't a negotiation. This was a game where the humans were meant to play by the rules set by the old powers, and nothing more. "I disagree, Ambassador Fiddler," Carter said, her voice calm but carrying the sharp edge. "The galaxy has spent centuries in a cycle of fear, manipulation, and power struggles. I'm not asking for Earth to be handed control. I'm asking for a fair chance to contribute. If you want true security, you need unity, not just a few species making decisions for everyone else." The room fell silent. Carter's words had landed, but the others refused to acknowledge them. Instead, the Asterians shifted uneasily. The Skroth smirked, and the Thylith remained quiet, seemingly absorbed in their own thoughts. As the debate continued, Carter could feel her frustration bubbling up. Every time humanity tried to offer something of value, the galaxy's leaders seemed intent on ignoring it. Then, the breaking point arrived. General Zorak, the Skroth representative, stood up, his massive form towering over the table. His eyes glinted with barely veiled contempt. "Enough of this," he snarled. "You humans are nothing but children, pretending to understand the complexities of galactic defense. Your people barely survived their first true conflict. You're lucky you even managed to drive back the Cyrex. What makes you think you're fit to join us in something as important as this?" The insult was deliberate, designed to provoke. It was a challenge, a test of humanity's resolve. For a long moment, Carter remained silent, her hands clenched into fists on the table. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the weight of centuries of injustice pressing down on her. She thought of the billions on Earth who had struggled, fought, and sacrificed for this very moment. She thought of the families who had lost loved ones in the defense of their world. And she thought of the human spirit, a spirit that would not back down. The words came before she could stop them. "You are wrong," she said, her voice low but resolute. "You have no idea what humanity is capable of, but I will show you." With that, Carter stood up abruptly, the room falling into a stunned silence. Her delegation followed her, not a word spoken between them. As she turned toward the exit, she paused and glanced back at the assembly. The faces of the galactic leaders were a mix of disbelief and anger. But Carter didn't care anymore. The doors of the council chamber closed behind her, and with it, humanity's final act of defiance. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the massive doors to the council room slid shut behind Ambassador Alyssa Carter and her delegation. The sound of the doors' resounding thud seemed to echo throughout the entire station, a heavy punctuation on the most dramatic moment in the galaxy's political history. Inside, the other delegates were frozen, as if time itself had come to a halt. General Zorak's expression was one of both shock and barely contained fury. The Asterians exchanged silent, tense glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. For all their calculated diplomacy and centuries of experience, they had never anticipated a walkout from the humans. The Seraphim, quiet and thoughtful, were caught in a mix of admiration and confusion. The galaxy had never seen such a bold, public act of defiance from one of its younger members. Outside the chamber, the human delegation moved swiftly through the halls of Vortha Prime, their footsteps the only sound in the otherwise quiet corridors. Ambassador Carter led the way, her jaw clenched, her eyes steely. She didn't look back, but she could feel the eyes of the galaxy's leaders burning into her back. Once they reached the secure transport docks, Carter turned to face her team. The look on her face was one of determination, but beneath it was a storm of emotion, anger, frustration, and a deep sense of betrayal. They had tried, time and time again, to make the galaxy's leaders see reason. But the sheer arrogance of the Skroth and Asterians had finally pushed her past the breaking point. "We've made our stand," she said quietly to her delegation, her voice a calm contrast to the tension of the moment. "We won't let them treat us like this any longer." Her chief diplomat, Derek Calloway, nodded. "You made the right choice, Alyssa. The others were never going to listen. Not like this." Carter took a deep breath, glancing up at the towering stars beyond the docking bay's viewports. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. The galaxy's leaders may have underestimated humanity, but they hadn't seen the resolve of Earth's people. She knew that this walkout wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Meanwhile, back inside the council chamber, the silence was starting to break. Asterian Ambassador Thaler was the first to speak, his voice betraying a rare hint of unease. This cannot be allowed. How dare they? "We must address this immediately," General Zorak growled, his voice echoing off the high walls. "If humanity believes they can walk away without consequence, they are sorely mistaken. We cannot let such insolence stand." Ambassador Thaler raised a hand to silence him, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "We will issue a formal statement," he said, his voice stiff. "This will not go unanswered." But the murmurs of agreement that followed Thaler's words were far from unified. The Seraphim representative, Irindor, spoke slowly, his voice filled with a calm wisdom that contrasted sharply with the anger in the room. Perhaps we are missing the point here. Humans have shown a level of courage that we have not seen from many of the other species in this council. Maybe this walkout is not simply an act of defiance, but a wake-up call." The Skroth general scoffed at Irindor's words. "Courage. This is nothing but arrogance." Irindor met Zorak's gaze with quiet intensity. "It is both, General, but you cannot ignore the message. Humanity will no longer be treated as a lesser species. This act, whether you like it or not, has changed the conversation." As the arguments continued inside the chamber, Alyssa Carter and her delegation prepared to leave Vortha Prime for Earth. The weight of their decision hung in the air like a thick fog. They knew that walking out had made them a target, and that many factions would view it as a direct challenge to their authority. But Carter felt a surge of confidence deep within her. If the galaxy's leaders thought they could ignore humanity, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. In the coming days, the news of the walkout spread across the galaxy like wildfire. News feeds were flooded with reactions, ranging from outrage to admiration. Earth's bold move had taken the galaxy by surprise, and in doing so, it had given humanity the attention it had been desperately seeking. The galaxy was watching. The news of humanity's dramatic walkout spread like wildfire across the galaxy. From the bustling markets of the Asterian homeworld to the dark, war-torn sectors of Skroth territory, every corner of the galaxy was talking about it. Some whispered about the audacity of it, others about the danger it posed. But one thing was clear: humanity had done something no one had expected. For the next few days, Vortha Prime became the center of an intense storm of media attention, diplomatic pressure, and public outcry. News feeds across the galaxy flashed images of Ambassador Alyssa Carter as she boarded the transport that would take her back to Earth, her expression resolute and unwavering. The Scroth and Asterians were the first to respond publicly. In a coordinated statement, both factions condemned humanity's actions as an affront to galactic unity. The arrogance of the human race knows no bounds. General Zorek's voice boomed across the news, his words dripping with contempt. They cannot simply march in here, disrupt the peace talks, and expect to be taken seriously. Ambassador Thaler, ever the diplomat, was more measured in his response. While we respect the right of any species to express dissatisfaction, we cannot allow such behavior to go unchallenged. The human race has shown that they are not yet ready for the responsibilities of galactic leadership. But there were other voices. Far from condemning humanity, a surprising number of lesser factions began to voice their support for the human delegation. The Seraphim, known for their tranquil wisdom, released a statement calling for calm and reflection. Perhaps it is time for us to reconsider the old hierarchies, Erindor, the Seraphim representative, said in a quiet but firm voice. Humanity's actions remind us that the galaxy cannot remain in the hands of a few entrenched powers forever. From the industrial colonies of the Ogren, a gruff species known for their resilience and independence, came a different kind of support. Their leader, Goran, issued a fiery broadcast. The humans have shown they are not afraid to speak the truth. If the rest of us are too afraid to follow their example, then we deserve to be ruled by the Asterians and Scroth. On Earth, the response was no less heated. The United Earth Federation had watched the walkout in real time, and while some leaders were concerned about the potential ramifications, the general public was overwhelmingly supportive of Carter's decision. News feeds were flooded with broadcasts of her speech to the delegation before they left Vortha Prime, a fiery, determined address that had galvanized humanity's resolve. "We will no longer be silenced," she had said, her voice unwavering as she addressed her people. "This galaxy belongs to all of us, and humanity will not be relegated to the sidelines. We are not asking for a seat at the table. We are demanding one." Across Earth, rallies erupted in major cities, with humans proudly waving flags and chanting their support for the bold stance their leaders had taken. Earth was a planet unified, not just in its support for Carter, but in its newfound resolve to challenge the established order of the galaxy. As the days passed, the galaxy's political scene grew increasingly tense. The Asterians and Scroth, their reputations threatened by the growing support for humanity, scrambled to regain control of the narrative. But despite their efforts, it became clear that they could not simply erase the impact of humanity's actions. Ambassador Carter, back on Earth, prepared for the next step. She knew this moment was only the beginning. The galaxy had been forced to take notice of humanity, and now they had to decide what to do with it. She gathered her advisors, military leaders, and diplomats for a series of high-level meetings. A strategy had to be devised, one that would not only elevate humanity's standing in the galaxy, but also ensure that the fight for equality was no longer just about political power. Humanity had made its first move, and now, with the galaxy's attention focused on them, the next chapter was about to begin. The galaxy was on edge. For weeks after the walkout, the political atmosphere had only grown more charged. The response from the various factions had been mixed, but one thing was clear. Humanity's presence in the galactic stage was no longer something that could be ignored. Ambassador Alyssa Carter had made her point, but now came the harder part, turning their newfound attention into leverage. Back on Earth, Carter sat in a high-level conference room, surrounded by the brightest minds from her government, military, and diplomatic corps. The atmosphere was tense. No one had expected the swift fallout of the Council's reaction to the walkout, but now it was clear that humanity was facing a delicate balancing act. The galaxy's major powers, particularly the Asterians and Scroth, would not simply back down. They would push back hard. "Ambassador Carter," began General Marcus Hale, a no-nonsense military leader who had overseen humanity's defense against the Cyrex. "We've been monitoring communications from the Skroth and Asterians. Their response is predictable. They're calling us destabilizing forces, a threat to galactic order. But there's a reason why the smaller factions have started to speak up. They're looking for something different. They're looking for leadership." Carter nodded, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "I've seen the reports. The Seraphim, the Ogryn, even the Thyleth. They see an opportunity to shift the power dynamics, and if we play our cards right, we could have their support." "There's no question about that," Hale agreed. "The question is, how do we handle the larger factions? If we take an aggressive stance now, we risk alienating those smaller factions we've gained support from." The room fell quiet for a moment, each member considering the complexity of the situation. The tension was thick, but Carter knew this was exactly what they had expected. The first wave had been a shock, but now it was time for the counter-move. "We need to make it clear that humanity is not just a disruptor. We're a unifier," Carter said, finally breaking the silence. "If the Asterians and Skroth want to play their power games, fine. But humanity will offer a different kind of leadership, one that doesn't rely on military dominance or manipulative politics." "What are you suggesting, Melissa?" asked political strategist Linda Fox, her eyes narrowing. "We can't just walk away from Vortha Prime again. We need to show them that we're serious." Carter leaned forward. "We'll call for a new summit. But this time, it won't be held on Vortha Prime. We'll hold it on a neutral world, one of the outer colonies. We'll invite the smaller factions, the ones that want change. We'll make sure the Asterians and Skroth know they're invited, but they won't have the same control. Let them come, or let them stay away, and be seen for what they are, self-serving and unwilling to evolve." The room fell silent again as the plan settled in. It was risky, but it was bold. A message to the galaxy that humanity was serious about uniting the galaxy, not playing by the old rules. "By doing this," Fox said after a long pause, "we'll be sending a message that we won't be intimidated, but we're also showing the galaxy that we're the ones willing to step forward and lead." Carter nodded, her mind already moving ahead. She had seen what could happen if they didn't seize this opportunity. The smaller factions might be swayed to support the larger powers, or worse, they could turn on humanity in fear of retaliation. They needed to strike while the iron was hot. "It's time to show the galaxy that we're not just looking for power. We're looking for real unity. A unity that doesn't come at the cost of others." The room erupted into a mix of agreement and concern. It was a gamble, but the stakes were too high to play it safe. Within days, humanity's proposal for a new summit was sent across the galaxy. The invitation was clear: a gathering of species willing to put aside old rivalries and forge a new path forward. Earth was offering a fresh start, one not dictated by old alliances and old hatreds. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Smaller factions expressed interest almost immediately. The Asterians and Skroth, however, remained silent, waiting, watching, uncertain of how to respond. The stage was set. Humanity had made its move, and now the galaxy would have to decide. Would they continue down the path of division, or would they take the chance to build something new? The galaxy held its breath as the day of the new summit approached. The invitation had been sent, and while the smaller factions eagerly accepted, the responses from the Asterians and Skroth had been far from welcoming. In fact, they had remained silent, an unsettling silence that spoke volumes. The message they were sending was clear. Humanity was still a wild card in their eyes, a force they couldn't control. But the clock was ticking, and the summit would go ahead with or without them. Ambassador Alyssa Carter stood on the balcony of the diplomatic complex in New Rome, Earth's capital. The towering skyline stretched out before her, bathed in the soft light of the late afternoon sun. Her mind was focused, her gaze unwavering. The summit was humanity's chance to shift the balance of power in the galaxy, but it was also a gamble. If the larger powers refused to show up, it would only deepen the rift between them and the smaller factions. But if they came, it could force them into a position where they would have to confront the new order. Beside her, General Marcus Hale stood, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You're sure about this, Alyssa? If the Asterians and Skroth show up, they'll be looking to undermine everything we've built here. They won't just let this summit be a success." Carter nodded. "I'm counting on it. If they show up, we'll have the chance to expose their true nature to the rest of the galaxy. This isn't just about us. It's about giving the smaller factions a voice, a real chance at power." Hale raised an eyebrow. "It's risky, but maybe that's exactly what we need right now." At the same time, across the galaxy, delegates from various species began to gather on the neutral planet of Turax, a barren world chosen for its strategic location on the edge of known space. The planet was remote and had no inherent allegiances, making it the perfect place for such an unprecedented summit. The diverse factions were wary but hopeful. For many of them, this summit was the first chance they had ever been given to participate in galactic decisions on equal footing. Among them were the Seraphim, their graceful forms moving silently through the landing docks, exuding a quiet sense of purpose. Their representative, Erindor, was one of the first to arrive, his golden eyes reflecting a deep, thoughtful gaze. He had long been a supporter of humanity's cause, believing that the galaxy was stagnating under the control of the same old powers. The Ogryn were also present, their burly figures imposing as they marched in with their usual blunt but determined manner. Goran, their leader, was a force of nature, his booming voice ready to advocate for his people. "It's time to break the chains that hold us," he had said in the days leading up to the summit. Humanity's right. The old guard can't keep their grip forever. Even the Thyleth, a mysterious and elusive species known for their long, silent observations, had sent a delegate, a rarity in and of itself. The Thyleth rarely involved themselves in galactic politics, preferring to remain detached. Yet their participation in the summit was a sign that something was shifting in the galaxy. Perhaps they too, like the others, were tired of the endless power games played by the Asterians and Skroth. When the summit hall opened for the first official session, the air was thick with anticipation. Delegates from over a dozen species gathered in the vast, circular chamber, their faces a mixture of curiosity and tension. Earth's delegation, led by Carter, was seated at the head of the table, surrounded by the representatives of the smaller factions. The seats reserved for the Asterians and Skroth remained empty, at least for the moment. The doors slid open, and one by one, the leaders of the smaller factions took their seats. Carter kept her gaze steady, her posture confident. This was her moment. Humanity had come to the table not as a lesser species, but as equals. And soon, the rest of the galaxy would have to acknowledge that. Just as the opening statements were about to begin, the doors to the chamber opened again, and in walked the Asterians. Their ambassador, Thaler, entered first, flanked by several high-ranking military officers. Behind them, the massive form of General Zorak, representing the Skroth, loomed like a dark shadow. The room fell silent. The Asterians had come, but their presence was a calculated move. Carter's heart raced, but her expression remained calm. This was it. The old powers had arrived, but they would not dictate the terms of this summit. Not anymore. The stage was set. The future of the galaxy now hung in the balance. The Asterians and Skroth had arrived, but the atmosphere in the summit chamber was far from the intimidating silence Carter had feared. As the two delegations took their seats, a murmur rippled through the room. The smaller factions were watching, waiting. The balance of power in the galaxy was shifting, and this summit would determine how it would shift, and whether humanity could guide it toward something better. Ambassador Thaler, the Asterian representative, sat with a calm, almost regal air, his posture straight and proud. He glanced briefly at Carter, then around the room, as though assessing each delegate with his piercing blue eyes. General Zorak, standing behind him, exuded an air of aggression. His sharp gaze never left the humans, his expression unreadable. But it was the human delegation that had the true focus of the room. Ambassador Alyssa Carter, with her cool demeanor and unwavering confidence, sat at the head of the table, poised to lead. The smaller factions, the Seraphim, the Ogryn, and the Thyleth, watched her carefully, hopeful that humanity would prove itself as a force of change rather than another faction seeking power. "Let us begin," Carter said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that echoed through the chamber. The sound of her voice was a reminder that humanity had come here to challenge the status quo, not to beg for a place at the table. "We are gathered here to discuss the future of our galaxy. It is clear that the current system, dominated by the same few powers, is not sustainable. It is time for a change." Feller raised an eyebrow, but did not interrupt. He was the first to speak, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "Change is all well and good, Ambassador Carter, but what you propose is nothing short of an upheaval. The galaxy has existed in its current form for millennia. To simply ignore the suffering and stagnation that the current system perpetuates." Carter cut him off sharply, her eyes locking with his. "Yes, Ambassador, that's exactly what I'm proposing. The galaxy needs a future that is not dictated by a handful of powerful species, but one where every voice is heard, where every species has a chance to thrive." The tension in the room was palpable. The smaller factions, some of whom had never even been invited to such a summit before, exchanged glances. For many of them, this was the moment they had been waiting for, a chance to be part of something larger, to rise above the shadow of the Skroth and Asterians. They had been neglected for far too long. General Zorek's eyes burned with disdain as he stepped forward. "You underestimate the strength of the old powers, Ambassador," he growled, his voice like a low rumble of thunder. "What you speak of is chaos. The galaxy cannot function without order, without control. That's the problem," Carter said evenly. "Order at the expense of justice is no order at all." The room was still. Even the Asterians and Skroth seemed momentarily taken aback by the intensity of her words. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was as if the weight of the moment hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if the galaxy itself were holding its breath. Finally, Erindor, the Seraphim delegate, spoke, his voice calm but unwavering. "Ambassador Carter speaks the truth," he said, his golden eyes piercing. "The current order serves only a few, while the many suffer. It is time to build something new, a future based on cooperation, not domination." The Ogryn leader, Goran, slapped his massive fist onto the table. "Enough of this talk. It's time to act. The galaxy's been stuck in its ways for too long, and humanity's right to call it out. We need to take a stand." Even the Thyleth delegate, who had remained largely silent until now, nodded in agreement. "A new future is possible, if we have the courage to take it." The silence that followed was different this time, one of contemplation. The smaller factions, once so hesitant, were beginning to see that this was no longer just a political battle. It was a moral one. Humanity was challenging the very foundation of the galaxy's power structure, and with it, they were inspiring others to do the same. Ambassador Carter looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every delegate. The Asterians and Skroth had tried to dominate the conversation, to impose their will. But the tide was turning. The future of the galaxy no longer belonged to them alone. "The time for words is over," Carter said finally, her voice resolute. "It's time to build a new order, one that values all species, a true coalition, where power is shared, not hoarded." The Asterians and Skroth looked at one another, their faces hardened with the weight of their decisions. They could feel the shift, the growing tide of support for humanity's vision. It was no longer a matter of whether they could stop it. It was a matter of how they would respond. The galaxy was on the brink of a new era, and humanity was leading the charge.